Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I am J. Warner Wallace. We have been talking about how to develop a reasonable, evidential Christian faith. Not a faith that is blind and has no evidence to support it at all, or a faith that is unreasonable and that it believes something in spite of evidence to the contrary. What we're talking about here is developing a faith that is grounded in evidence that we can examine, we can investigate, and then we can communicate to others, even though, of course, you won't get every question you could possibly have answered, though you'll still have some open questions. By the way, this is true for every case I've ever worked. Even the best cases still have many unanswered questions. But you'd have enough good evidence to point to a certain conclusion, even though you have to take a step of trust in light of the evidence. That's the kind of faith that I think we can have as Christians, that we can actually embrace and develop and then communicate to others. Now, if you've been with us the last few weeks, you know that we've talked about embracing your duty, about training to get ready for this, about investigating truth claims, and then we started talking about how we communicate these truth claims to others, the kind of the last thing that we do in this process. And we've already talked about, for example, picking a jury and instructing the jury. Those are all other episodes we've done. And now we're going to, when I say jury, I mean the people around you, your family members, knowing who's receptive, who's not, and then how to help your receptive family members and friends understand the role of evidence in all of this. But now what we're going to talk about are some tips for starting a gospel presentation. What I mean here is that every time we do a jury trial, we will select the jury and then we will instruct the jury. Then at some point we're going to do an opening statement. And our opening statements are pretty robust. And if you've watched any of our episodes on Dateline, you've probably seen some of these, because most of my cases that went to trial, the cameras were right there in the courtroom with us. And so you know that these kinds of statements can be quite persuasive on their own right? And this is what we want to be able to do as Christians. We want to be able to make an opening statement that is persuasive. Look, Jesus did this. Every major teaching of Jesus in the Gospels, he actually takes the time to capture the imagination and the attention of his followers and his audience by making incredibly good opening statements. A few lines, a paragraph, a couple of verses that are really powerful. For example, if you look at Mark chapter 13, let's go there now. This is at the beginning of what is known as the Olivet Discourse. He's going to talk to his disciples. They are overlooking the temple, and he's about to capture their attention. These are the first words that Jesus is going to say in this teaching. Take a look at them. See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be frightened. Those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Now think about that for a second. You're about to do some important teaching, and you just laid out what is just going to be you're talking about the future, and you're laying out what just the beginning. It doesn't sound great, right? I mean, it sounds pretty awful in many ways. Do you think that Jesus accurately or effectively captured the attention of his hearers? Of course he did. This is the nature of good opening statements, right? The first words you say are either going to set the tone good in a positive way or set the tone in a poor way. And it's up to us to make sure that we only get one chance sometimes to make a first impression, one chance to communicate to our friends, our family members, and we don't want to lose that opportunity by kind of starting off on the wrong foot. So I want to give you a couple of simple tips that may help you to start off on the right foot. Now, the first one I'm going to offer for you may seem rather simple, but it's an important one, and it's this. You've got to practice your opening. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, right? Because a lot of these kinds of openings we're talking about when we're sharing the gospel are just conversational. They're just that I'm sitting next to my friend, I'm sitting at dinner with somebody. You want me to practice that interaction? Well, yeah, actually I do. I'll tell you that the best openings we've done in front of a jury have been well practiced. And the attorney I work with most often is a guy named John Lewin. And he is awesome. And he does practice. And it may not mean that he practices the entire thing, but he at least practices those areas where he thinks he needs work. Now, how does that apply to us? Well, I will tell you that this may sound crazy, but when I was working about an hour from here in Los Angeles County, every time I drove to work, I had about, when I say an hour, this is Los Angeles time, okay? So when you're on the freeways in Los Angeles, trust me, 13 miles could be an hour. I was 50 miles from work. So sometimes I'd have 3 hours a day to drive back and forth to work. And as I would do that, I would have lots to think about. And sometimes a half an hour would go by and I wouldn't even realize it went by because I am lost in my thoughts. And what I'm thinking about most often are role-playing scenarios in my head. In other words, I'm rehearsing, I'm practicing what I would say. Sometimes it's maybe I was a youth pastor for years during those times, and I would be practicing my sermon on Sunday. Or I'd be practicing what would I say if scenarios. What would I say if somebody asked me this? What would I say if somebody asked me that? How would I start a conversation? And then I'd start to kind of think about, well, if I say this, that's going to knock over that domino. And if that falls that way, how would I respond? I'm playing in my mind almost a game of chess with an imaginary counterpart in which I am having a dialogue, a mental dialogue about all the things I would say or respond to. I know I'm not alone in this. My friend Greg Kokel at Stand to Reason has often shared that we do practice in our heads what we're going to say in any number of scenarios. And that's why sometimes when you'll hear somebody who's got a really quick answer and you think, wow, how in the world is that? Well, it's not necessarily that he's quick-witted. It might just be that he's rehearsed well in his mind for a long time before you actually ask the question. So we can do this. Look, you're thinking about something all the time. Sometimes I'm thinking about stuff that doesn't even matter. It's sports-related junk that is just what happened last night. I just need to reappropriate my thoughts and to start practicing in my head. And you've got the time to do it because all of us have some time in which our minds are just wandering. And that's when we can take the time to practice. The first tip I would suggest to any of you is take the time to practice in your head scenarios. And then imagine the scenarios 2 or 3 steps down the road where you've said something and then what kinds of responses might I get? And if I get this response, what will I say in return? These are important practical steps you can take to get ready to make a good opening statement. Before the break, let me just give you one more. And that's this. You have to protect your first impression. You have to protect your first impression. Now, we all hear that, right? You get one chance at a first impression. And that's true. And sometimes we can be fooled into thinking that first impression is the moment we begin to talk about the gospel. I don't know why it didn't work out the way it did. I'd been practicing this, and I sure enough, I had the opportunity, and I finally opened my mouth and I said something, but for some reason, it didn't work out the way I thought it would. Well, why does that happen? Why does it not work out the way you thought it would? Sometimes it doesn't work out the way you thought it would because you've been making a first impression for many, many weeks, for years maybe, with some of the people you care the most about. And after making that first impression, you've left them with an impression that's either good or bad, positive or negative. And it's up to us then to overcome. This is why it's so hard sometimes to share truth claims with people who know us really well, because they know all of our blemishes, they know all of our good stuff, all of our bad stuff, and they don't yet understand this idea that all of us share this kind. We're all fallen, designed in the image of God, but deeply rebellious and fallen. This enigma of man may not be clear to your unbelieving friends. So they're a little less patient with us. How many times have you heard that it was some form of Christian hypocrisy that turned people off to the point where they wouldn't listen to the message being offered by a Christian? Well, okay, I think that I understand that, look, we're all hypocrites. All of us fall short of even our own standards that we build for ourselves before we know that there is an ultimate standard. But if you're not a Christian, you may not necessarily kind of get that or understand that or be willing to overlook that or be empathetic toward that. So we're going to have to be on our best behavior. I have noticed this about even being around my dad. is that I'm afraid sometimes that he's going to see something in my character, something in my demeanor that is going to be an obstacle for him rather than kind of pave a smooth landing for me as I'm trying to begin a conversation or land an idea. So remember, it's going to be really important for us to protect our first impression, but the first impression starts long before you open your mouth to share the gospel. We know that when we're selecting a jury. Before we make that opening statement, we've spent a couple of days, maybe a week with a jury selecting them, and they've been watching us. They've been watching us interact with each other at the table. They've been watching us interact with the defense attorney. They've been watching us interact with the judge and the bailiffs. They have some sense of who we are, and we do our good job. We try to do a good job of making sure we protect our impression with the jury, because we do not want to poison, and by the way, both sides do this. We do not want to poison a jury. The first impression is going to start long before we open our mouth. That's true for you and me too as we share the gospel. So there's 2 quick tips. Take a break. We'll come back and talk about a couple more.
Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own junior detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more.
Okay, let's talk about another tip that might help you as you make the case for what you believe, as you just begin to start conversations, as you make your opening statement. And that's a simple one. You got to be eager and energetic. You got to be eager and energetic. It might sound like that could be like obvious, right? But it's just when people are passionate, they are far more likely to be persuasive. There's a connection between those 2 things. And if you're wondering how you can manufacture energy or manufacture being eager, I will give you a tip to how to become more eager, a tip for the tip. And that's this. There's a connection between preparedness and your eagerness. A connection between being prepared and being, look, you know when you were going to school, right? You were in high school or in college, and then the professor or the teacher would say, we're going to have a test on Friday, and that's like, oh gosh, we got a test next Friday. But then when you finally get there on Friday, there's usually one person, some guy or gal in the class, who's a pain in the rear because they are so ridiculously happy that it's test day. Look, we have all had friends like that, right? Somebody we knew who on test day is just like buoyant about how great this is. They get a chance to take a test. Who does that? Well, most of us don't do that. Well, why is that person so eager and energetic about taking the test on test day? Because they've studied. They are prepared. This is the day they get to show how much more they know than you. This is the day they get to shine because they're prepared. There's actually a relationship between being prepared and being eager. The same could be said about our being eager to share the gospel. Because most people I know when I talk about evangelism or when I train evangelism at churches, the scariest thing is a first contact. The scariest thing is that point of first saying anything. Just making the first statement. Now listen, once you get past that and you've said something and the other person's starting to respond to you and now you're in a conversation, wow, it's a lot easier. The most difficult thing is the first statement, the first few words. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips that might help you, a couple of examples of opening statements that might work for you. One is from James Picardo, who wrote a book called Unsilenced. Of course, I like to talk about my own books, but I will tell you, the book you should get, if not one of mine, is Unsilenced by James Picardo. You can go online. It's a self-published book, but I think they still sell it online. Now, he's got a great opening statement, and he just says, if you'll just do this, and he does it no matter where he is, he begins with this rather bold statement, but it kicks off the conversation every time, and that is simply this. So, what do you think happens when you die? James is always going to start with some version of this statement. So listen, when you die, where do you think you go? What do you think happens after you close your eyes for the last time? In other words, what do you think happens when you die? Now, that's actually a pretty interesting statement because it does a couple of things. It's very diagnostic in the sense that whatever response you get from that person is going to tell you where they stand spiritually. If they say, I just go back in the dirt, I don't think anything happens when I die, well, then you know that they don't believe in an afterlife. If they tell you, well, I think you're reincarnated, then they've got, you know what kind of direction to go then. If they say, well, I think that you go to heaven or hell, you can still talk about what they believe. And a lot of people in the culture will say that. They may not be Christians. But my point here is that all you have to do then is prepare for 3 or 4 alternative responses once you ask this question. And although this question sounds like it's kind of like rough in the sense that you don't know somebody and you're asking that kind of question, if you'll be bold enough to do it, you'll see that that's the last time in the conversation you'll have to be bold. Because from that point on, you'll actually be in a conversation that's fruitful. It's just try it. Here's another one. Grover Peterson's a man I met in Montana. And he says this whenever he encounters somebody and wants to start a spiritual conversation. He says, you know, everything in life has a design, a function, a purpose. What's yours? Now that's a very easy, soft way to start a conversation, wouldn't you agree? Because people love to talk about purpose. But what's interesting here is he has attached purpose to design. So when you start having this kind of conversation, it's not hard to move to, because if someone gives you a purpose, you might say, well, how do you know that's your purpose? Eventually, the best way to discover purpose is to ask the manufacturer. If you don't know what a certain device is for, what it's used for, well, you could Google it, you could go online, search for it, find the manufacturer of that little widget, and then the manufacturer will have a description of what they designed the widget to do. It turns out the surest way to know what the widget is used for is to consult with the manufacturer. That's true for you and I too. You want to know what you're here for? Ask the manufacturer. So I think in the end, this is a good way to begin a conversation that will get you talking about the designer. Let me do one more quick tip and then we'll take a break. About starting your opening statement. I've given you a couple of examples now of how you might kind of be prepared well enough to conquer that fear. By the way, if you practice those 2 things, you'll be ready to start the conversation. Let me give you one more quick tip. That's this one. Be sure to make promises you can deliver. What I mean by that is, at some point, we're going to say something that we have to be able to back it up. If we make a claim about the nature of God or the nature of the universe that points to God, well, then we better know enough about that claim to be able to finish it if somebody asks us an important question about the claim. And you might be in a place where you overstate a claim, and boy, you hate to be there. But if you do, if you get into water that you think is just a little bit too deep, then you can say, you know what, that's a great question, let me get back to you. And then you better get back to them. We have to make promises and then deliver. Listen, when we do this in jury trials, we often say that we're going to make the case so strongly in the opening statement that if we simply deliver on the promises we made in the opening statement, we're going to win. And then we try for the next few weeks as we present the evidence to deliver on every promise we made in the opening statements. You too have to make sure that you deliver on any claims you make when you're talking to your friends and family. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back and deliver you a last, about 1 or so, tips on how to make a good opening statement.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions. We keep hearing about this mass exodus of youth leaving the church, which begs the question, why are so many young people leaving the church today?
Yeah, and I think sometimes the numbers can be kind of inflated, so we always kind of argue about, well, how bad is the problem? But I think it would be naive of us to say there's no problem at all. I think there is definitely a problem with young people who are challenged in their college years and they walk away. Now, I think it's a simple mathematical equation. And here's what it is. Now, Brett Kunkel, who you also know from Stand to Reason, we have kind of worked together on this, and we have a slightly different variation of this equation. Here's what we see, though. We see that I see there are 3 things when added together spell trouble. One is we have young people who are really underprepared. They're not adequately equipped to be able to defend and make a case for what they believe. They just aren't. So they come into college, those college years, and they're not adequately prepared. The second thing we see is a hostile culture and university environment. So that's the second component in the equation. So you've got a place where the higher percentage of non-believers are in the academia than are in the general population. A more distrust of our sacred texts exists in academia than there are in the general population. So in that kind of an environment, you've got unprepared young people. Add to that a hostile campus environment. Then you have the third thing, which I think is a big deal killer for a lot of people, and that is just our basic fallen human nature to pursue our desires. So if you can tell a young person, if you could have told me, hey, I've got an alternative worldview for you that gives you a creation story and even gives you a purpose that's different than, and this actually allows you to do the things you always wanted to do without feeling bad about it.
Throw morals
Yes,
on.
yes. Well, what do you think young people are going to say? They're unprepared to defend what they believe. They're in a hostile environment, and they really have the inner inclination of their fallen desires to begin with. And I think those three things lead to what? What possible good can come out of that situation? So I think in order for us to respond as the church, we need to at least do one thing. We can't control the fallen nature of all of us. That's what we are. But we could prepare better before we enter into that setting and before we have those drives pull us away from our church. We could actually prepare our young people better. That's the one thing I think we can do as a church, is we can prepare, at least take the first piece of that equation away. And I think our young people will survive a lot better.
Okay, we've been talking about tips to use in the opening statement. And I want to give you one more that is maybe a little bit harder to understand, and that is this idea of capturing momentum. One of the reasons why we will do an opening statement that runs sometimes, it can be robust. In other words, we're going to lay out everything in the opening statement. We're going to, number one, recite the narrative of the crime to the jury so they know how did it start, how did it finish. We want them to hear the chronological narrative of everything that led up to the crime, the commission of the crime, and everything the suspect did after. We want them to hear the whole story. Then we're going to present X, Y, and Z to demonstrate that this defendant sitting at the table here is actually the person who did the crime. And we want it to be very robust. We want it to be like, wow, if that's true, this guy's got to be guilty. That's the kind of thinking we're hoping to get in our jury after the opening statement. Wow, why are we even here? If all that's true, this guy is ridiculously guilty. We want that kind of certainty. Now, don't get me wrong, the next person to open will be the defense attorney, and he's going to try his best to say up front why our case has either been overstated or has got flaws in it or whatever he's going to say or she's going to say. But what we're looking for is an opening statement that seems so ridiculously overwhelming that there's no way this guy could be innocent. And that's how we begin. Of course, we've got the reason, we've got evidence to demonstrate that he's guilty, but what we want is momentum up front. Remember, it's like inertia in anything in physics. Once something is in movement, is in motion, it's harder to change it. A body in motion has a tendency to stay in motion unless it's met by something else. And what we want to do is put this body in motion. The same is true, I think, for those of us who want to get an opportunity to present the case for Christianity or an opportunity to share the gospel. I'm looking for those moments in the life of my friends and family member, even my own father, where it's like, wow, okay, this is a great opportunity just to say this. And I think it will be so timely and so appropriate and so impactful that now is the time to do it. This is a momentum moment. If I can just start here, I think we can really connect the dots for him and say something powerful. And sometimes you can be clever in the way you do it. I think sometimes, for example, when we start a statement that seems almost like counterintuitive to the person we're talking to, and then we show them why. So if someone complains about something or in the nature of Christians, I want to kind of turn the tables a little bit. Let me give you an example that I cite in the book, Forensic Faith. And by the way, this is the book we're talking about all this material from. It is Forensic Faith, and it's really how to help you develop a more evidential, a more reasonable Christian faith. And everything we've been talking about on the show, we just kind of skim on the surface, right? So what we try to do in books, of course, is to deep dive, to help you be even more prepared to make the case for what you believe and to experience your Christian faith differently so that we can be more effective as culture shapers in our culture, and we can actually even protect our families, our loved ones, our kids, because we know enough about why this is true to be able to make the case for it. Now, when it comes to capturing momentum, I've got a friend that I met years ago who occasionally gets involved in college level, university level debates. As a matter of fact, he leads, there's a group called Ratio Christi, which is, you probably, if you're watching NRB TV, you know that they also have a show on NRB TV. And his name is Ryan. And what Ryan does is, I describe it in much more detail in the book, but what Ryan was challenged to do is to have an interaction, a dialogue, a public dialogue on a stage with a person who was an atheist, to kind of interact on ideas related to God's existence and atheism. And at one point he was asked, Ryan, what do you think is the best evidence for God's existence? And that challenge, I could see something similar to that being stated. Now meanwhile, Ryan knows in his head that question comes with a bunch of baggage, because there's probably a reason in this young man's mind, the guy who was talking to Ryan, why he would say that God doesn't exist. But what he's asking here is, Ryan, why do you think? Now, I'm sure he was thinking, I can make my offer as to. Now, Ryan's thinking about that too. And he's thinking, okay, I want to give him an answer, but I kind of think I know where he's going to go. Because if you think about this, about 70% of all objections to God's existence are in the same category. And Ryan, knowing that, offered this response to what is the best evidence for God's existence. I thought it was quite clever. Take a look at it. He said, well, the best evidence for God's existence, that's evil. Evil? Yeah, evil. Because when you describe something as truly, transcendently evil, you're unwittingly acknowledging the existence of a true, objective, transcendent standard of good. But if there isn't a transcendent, objectively good God to act as that standard, evil is nothing more than a matter of your personal opinion. See, true evil requires a true standard of good by which to measure it. That's why evil is actually evidence for God's existence. Now, what he did there was he managed to capture momentum. He started off fast. He also, I suspect, addressed one of the major issues that his counterpart was going to offer against the existence of evil, and turned it on its ear and used it for the case instead of against the case. And that's really important, right? To kind of think cleverly and powerfully. If nothing else, this kind of response captures the attention of everyone who's listening. And it does one of the other things, it's that first impression thing we're talking about. So it kind of works on a number of levels. And because he's talked about this and thought about this and rehearsed this in his head, I'm not even sure how far before this interaction he even had to think about this, because he's been practicing this kind of thing in his head. Basically, all those tips we've talked about so far, Ryan was able to use in order to make this kind of statement that captures momentum. So start thinking about that as you're talking to your friends and family members about the gospel. You want to be well practiced, you want to be eager, you want to be passionate and prepared. You want to be able to capture momentum and protect your first impression. These are things you can do to make a good opening statement. Hope that helps you, and I'll see you right back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.